actually studied Hispanic philology. I didn't know that.
Oh, yes.
Here at the University of the Basque Country, and is now pursuing a master's degree in comparative literature and literary studies, also at the University of the Basque Country, and she's currently working on her MA thesis about Gothic literature, mythocriticism, and under the supervision of Dr. Raúl Montero and Dr. Mate Simonsen, and she is hoping to continue working on these topics for her PhD dissertation.
Yes. Thank you, Amaya, for the introduction, and thank you for having me here. And thank you all for coming. Today I will be talking about Full Metal Alchemist, which is a manga and an anime written and directed by Hiromu Arakawa. And I will be talking about the influence that Western European culture has had in this work, and also how the myths that are present in this work interact between themselves to create a point, to make a point for the audience. So first of all, I will be talking about three main myths that are the ones which I will be focusing on, which are Icarus' myth, Prometheus' myth, and Faust's myth, that are represented in this work by three characters that I will be introducing in 2 minutes. But first, I want to mention also that this work has a lot of references to other mythic creatures and other Western European religions, such as Christianity, for example. In the image we have, I believe, in the right? Yes. We can see the 7 deadly sins that appear personified in this anime. This is a clear reference to the Christian religion. And to the left and in the center, we have chimeras, which are a reference to Greek and, for extension, Roman mythologies. I could be talking about this for an hour if I wanted to, so I will be focusing just on the myths that I presented. But I think it's very interesting to see how, not only with these creatures, but also with the setting itself of the anime, the names of the characters, the names of the places, and the setting itself are strongly influenced by European culture. So, okay, I think I have to give a little bit of context of how the universe of Full Metal Alchemist works, so you can understand later the story of these characters and their evolution. So basically, we can see in Full Metal Alchemist that the world is ruled by this entity, this abstract entity, which is truth, or how itself says, I can be truth, or universe, or God, or all, or one, and I'm you, stating that it is everything and it's everywhere, kind of a pantheist point of view of the world. And this is basically the entity that rules the world and that also rules that also states the rules of alchemy, which in this case would be that you have to give something to get another thing. It's what it's called the Equivalence Principle in this universe. And this is a fundamental idea for the characters, because we will see that how the characters, the relationships that these characters have with the truth will determine their fate. And that's basically what happens, for example, with Edward Elric, which is the protagonist of the anime and one of the characters that I will be analyzing today. In the very beginning actually in the first volume of the manga and in the first chapter of the anime, Edward talks about Icarus and explicitly mentions him, saying that, talking about the myth about that hero that made wings out of wax so he could fly, but when he got too close to the sun, to God, the wax melted and he crashed to the ground. He's now introducing his background, his own story, stating that he too has flew too near to the sun and he has crashed, because as we see later in the anime, Edward has committed one of the biggest taboos on alchemy, which is human transmutation. He tried to bring back his mother from the death. And that is an unforgivable crime for alchemists, and I would dare to say the biggest transgressions of them all. So the anime starts like this, stating that he has committed a crime, he has paid the price for this crime because he has lost an arm, a leg, and his brother's body, who is now linked to an armor, and his soul is linked to an armor, but he has no physical human body. So the anime starts with the journey of Edward searching for the Philosopher's Stone, which is a way of cheating, I would say. It's a way of cheating in this universe because it's a way of getting back their bodies without giving anything in exchange. It would be a way to mock the truth. So he starts like this, and later on we will see how his viewpoint changes and how he decides to take other options. Now we have Roy Mustang. I would link him with Prometheus for a very clear reason. And that is because his transgressions, different from Edward and the other characters that we will be seeing, is justified. He's one of the best alchemists on Amestris, which is the country that they are from, and he has witnessed the Ishvalan work of extermination, which was one of the biggest genocides in this universe. Amestris went to war with this country, which was Ishval, and they end up killing most of its population. He witnessed that because he was already a state alchemist, and from that point on, he decided that he didn't want the story to repeat itself, so he decided that he had to make some changes in the government. And thus, we will see how from the beginning he's trying to go up in the military scale and trying to achieve what he thinks is fair. And later on we will see that this transgression itself, which is defying the Führer in this case, so it's not Nazi, but it's called the Führer, this transgression itself is fair, it's legitimate, and Arakawa knows this, and it's very clear with this. But then he will be committing another transgression that we will see later, and it will determine his life also. Last but not least, we have Father and Hohenheim, and I think it's important to present these two characters together because their story is strongly linked, and in fact, one of them is created thanks to the other. Father is the main villain of the story, and he was first an homunculus, which is the pic we have on the top left, I think. Yeah. And he met Hohenheim in Xerxes, which was an antique country in this anime. Hohenheim didn't even have a name. He was slave 23. He didn't have a name, he was illiterate, he didn't have freedom, he had nothing. he was the slave of an alchemist, the alchemist that created this homunculus that would later become father. So with Hohenheim's blood, with slave 23's blood, father was created. And after that, father starts a friendship, I would say, with slave 23. He gives him the name of Van Hohenheim, and he teaches him how to read and how to write, what later allows him to learn alchemy from his master. So all the knowledge that Hohenheim has, and even his identity, his name, is thanks to father. And at the same time, father exists thanks to Hohenheim. He's a product of partially truth, God, and Hohenheim. So they are strongly linked. And I believe, okay, this may be a little bit controversial because I believe these two characters are both based on the myth of Faust. And I will argue why right now. First of all, I would like to say that in this case, I will be referring to two particular versions of Faust, which are Christopher Marlowe's The Tragical Story of Dr. Faustus and Goethe's Faust. And there are two main differences between these works that are that while Goethe's Faust gets to redeem himself at the very end, Marlowe's Faust doesn't. And this determines the end of both these characters, father and Hohenheim. While Hohenheim does get redemption at the end, by the end of the work, father does not. And well, there are also other signs that suggest that both of these characters are inspired on Faust's myths, that are that, for example, father is the creator of these homunculi. We have seen that were personifications of the 7 deadly sins. In Christopher Marlowe's The Tragical Story of Dr. Faustus, we can see Faustus having a dialogue with these, meeting these sins, a personification of these sins. And there's actually a part of the work of Marlowe where we can see envy saying, "I cannot read and therefore wish all books burned." This is curious because in the anime we have envy as a character, which is one of the characters we've seen at the beginning. And moments before its death, envy basically dies being jealous of human friendship and their ability to support each other. And he basically says that he wants to destroy humans because he cannot understand how humans want to help each other and are always there for each other. He doesn't understand humanity. So that's why he doesn't want humans to exist. It's basically the same that Marlowe's envy says that I cannot read, so I don't want books to exist. On the other hand, I would argue that Hohenheim is based on Goethe's version of Faust because of the eternal feminine that appears in Goethe's Faust, and that is part of why Faust gets his redemption. So in Full Metal Alchemist, we have that thanks to his love for Trisha, which is the mother of Edward and the wife of Hohenheim, thanks to his love for her, he is determined to find a way to achieve mortality, because he's immortal thanks to father. And while father gave him this immortality as a gift, Hohenheim sees it as a punishment. This is also a quote that I wanted to include because for me it illustrates very well how these two parts of Faust work in this anime. And I will say it in Spanish if you don't mind, because I couldn't translate it very well to English, saying everything. So, por todo ello, para finalizar este análisis, se debe tener en cuenta el ambiguo carácter matriarcal del mito fáustico, pues como apunta Mircea Eliade, de las dos grandes divisiones míticas presentes en la historia de la humanidad, una se apoya en el sol y la figura del padre, mientras que la otra lo hace en el carácter vital de la naturaleza mediante la figura de la gran madre. En este sentido, el hilo narrativo de Fausto nos lleva de un contexto masculino y patriarcal, en el que la figura del sol presenta un papel dominante, a un modelo narrativo en el que el principio vital de la naturaleza cobra cada vez más importancia, hasta culminar en la natural integración de Fausto con el motivo matriarcal, simbolizado en la Madre Gloriosa y en el eterno femenino. So, after reading this, which basically states that there are two parts of Faust, which are a patriarchal part and a matriarchal part, which the first one being defined by the son and the fatherhood, and the second one being defined by the great mother, I can't help but think on these images of father holding the son and actually calling himself father, because it's the name that he gave himself, and Hoennheim choosing to have a family and wanting to achieve mortality, to be more natural, to have a more natural life. And finally, the point I wanted to make with this is that the representations of these myths in Full Metal Alchemist start a dialogue between themselves and with the truth that finally wants to solve the problem of whether or not these heroes deserve redemption. Because we have Icarus' myth, Prometheus' myth, in which we see how the heroes are punished, but there is no room for redemption. There is no after. They are punished and that's it. So basically, I would argue that the journey that each of the characters suffers and the interaction between them, because they are always interacting. At the end, Edward and Roy are part of the same government and the same military, and they work together, and they are always in dialogue with Father because they are trying to defeat him. So, for example, Edward changes his goal thanks to seeing what Father has done to create the philosophical stone, which I will not be explaining because I would be here like 2 hours trying to explain this. He sees how many pain that has caused, the philosopher's stone has caused, and he changes his goal from wanting to get a philosopher's stone to trick truth once again. He just accepts things as they are. He gives up his ability to do alchemy for his body and his brother's body. He just gives up and he says, okay, I can't trick truth anymore. This is not how the universe works. If I want something, I need to give something in change. So he chooses to give up his ability to do alchemy. It's different in the case of Roy Mustang because before I said that he committed a transgression, and that was the human transmutation, the one that Ed committed at the beginning. But the difference between them is that he committed it involuntarily. He didn't want to, he was forced to do so by Father. So at the end of the anime, we can see how he was given a philosopher's stone to restore the injuries that he had from fighting Father. And in this case, that would be fair because his transgression against truth wasn't voluntary. He did it unwillingly. So in this case, we can see how the use of the philosopher's stone was legitimate. In the case of Father, we can see that there is no redemption because until the very end, he does not want to give up his goal to defeat truth. He just wants to get more powerful and ultimately swallow truth and become God. He cannot do that, and instead of giving up his goal, he tries until the very end when truth finally swallows him and he loses what he was fighting for all these years, which was freedom. So basically, the point I would like to do is that Arakawa gets all these myths together and she inserts them in her work, but not only to reference them and just to make some characters that are like, okay, this one is like Prometheus and this one is like Icarus, so you get the point, they made this, they deserve punishment. No, because, for example, Edward's story actually starts from the end of his transgression, so we've already seen that. That's not important. What Arakawa tries to say is, okay, they've done this, but is there more to it? Is there a way to redeem them? Is there a way to undo what they did? And I think that these myths embodied in these characters make a dialogue that results finally in the conclusion that, in fact, you can get redemption, but you have to earn it. And that's basically what I wanted to say. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much. And now Maya will join us. So we can open the floor for questions. Oh, sorry. Now it's time for questions and comments. Anyone? Oh, yes. So, sorry, I will need maybe your assistance if you're so kind. I think actually Nola is the expert. I need to press the red button.
Yes, it's on.
It's on.
No.
Hello? No, it's not. Haha.
No, it's on.
Hello? Oh, yes, it is.
Thank you.
Well, I have like two questions. Well, I just wanted to say in the case of Enola's presentation that, well, it was really interesting. And when you were talking about Edward and how he decides to change his ways after seeing what happens with, with how it was called, the homunculus, the father, it reminded me of what happens in Frankenstein, because I think that the whole story of Frankenstein is like a cautionary tale, no? Because in the end, the narrator, at first at least, is Frankenstein, and he's talking about his story that he was using alchemy in order to transgress nature and be capable of creating life. And in the end, he's telling his story to Robert Walton, I think that he was called, so that he can convince him to not proceed with his pursuit of colonization and transgressing nature in the pole. So, yeah, I just wanted to say that it reminded me of that, and thank you very much. And I wanted to ask the presentation about Danai and so on. It was really interesting. And I just wanted to know which were the sources that you used in order to perform this. Yeah.
You mean
the textual sources,
Sorry, could you please? Thank you.
the literary sources.
well, as I said at the very beginning, we were not that interested in spending lots of time on that. So basically, that was something like very short part of the process at the very beginning. And it was basically what we did was we did it through a theatrical process that is just getting lots of text, really nothing that has to do with the academic way of doing it. Basically getting the different texts, reading them and seeing the resonance of the different options in the bodies. And from there, getting our responses, especially using Buto, the technique that I told you before. And by watching our responses to that, choose the one that resonated with us. So basically, it was very much a kind of theatrical kind of response instead of, thinking about it in the traditional way.
Yeah, so thank you very much.
More questions? Tatiana.
Thank you. Well, it's not a question, it's a comment, basically, for Sandra. When I was listening to you, you reminded me of, I don't know if you know this, but Eiko Ishioka's costumes for Bram Stoker's Dracula by Coppola. And, I think the process was also very theatrical. And she began working in the costumes. I mean, the typical thing they say when talking about the film is the costumes are the set. So they focus on the costumes, the rest was not so important. And then according to the costumes, they moved. They even changed the scenes because sometimes the actors couldn't move. So according to her dresses, they changed the scenes of the vampires and such. So yeah, only that. I love your presentation and it reminds me of Dracula, yeah.
Thank you. Well, speaking of that, I was reminded, I don't know, well, you probably know Matthew Barney.
Yes, of course.
Yes, and I was thinking of the Drawing Restraint series. Basically, he put himself under a series of physical restraints that made it very difficult for him to move and draw, perform. And the whole point was, how creative can I get under duress, so to speak? So how can I go around the limitations and actually explore what is possible, the potential, even when there are so many restrictions? And so I was thinking of that when thinking about your dialogue with the costume. But I was also thinking, well, this morning we had a lecture about textiles and narrating storytelling in the Viking Age through embroidery and textiles, and how the costume was very much a formative, fundamental part of the process of storytelling. Your body, and you as the performer were telling the story with the limitations of that and the materiality, the material aspect of the dress. So the dress itself, inanimate as it is, was part of the storytelling process. And so I find it absolutely fascinating. There's no questions because I'm still in awe of what you've done, so I need to process it, but it was very inspirational. More questions? So she goes first and then...
Yes. Oh, sorry. Well, first of all, thank you to the three of you for your wonderful presentations. I really enjoyed them a lot. But I have one question for Nola, because I'm not very learned in anime culture or anything. I've seen a few, and I couldn't help but notice that in at least the ones I've seen, there's sometimes a use of like Western and Christian imagery in Japanese anime that I've heard people argue that it's more like for the aesthetics of it rather than because it's very distant from their culture. So I've heard people argue that it's sometimes not as more symbolic reasoning behind it, but an aesthetic reasoning. So, for instance, in Death Note and Neon Genesis Evangelion, I don't know if you've seen them. Those are the ones I've seen. I haven't seen Full Metal Alchemist. But I was wondering if you also saw that in this case, like that argument of it being more aesthetic approach to that imagery of the deadly scenes and everything, or it's a more symbolic meaning. Thank you. Yes, one at a time, I think. You have to turn the other one off. Yes.
No. Thank you for your question. Yeah, I would say, I don't know if it's for the aesthetics. Maybe I would argue that as Japanese culture is something exotic or maybe unknown to us in comparison to maybe Greek mythology or Western European religions and culture, I would argue that maybe the reason why they use these myths or this background is because for them it is not as known as for us. I something of the aesthetics there, because maybe the fact of, at least in Full Metal Alchemist, I would say that they put their action in a country that is based in Western culture. That's clear. The names of the cities, the names of people, Edward Bradley, Roy Mustang, these are English names and Western names. There's Armstrong, German names. Well, the chief of the government, they call him Führer. And I would say maybe it's because they want to do it more exotic for them. It's an exotic place, as for us would be Japan, for example. And surely the aesthetics play part on this. So yeah, but I would say it's not the only reason. I would say it's also, it's a way also to expand the literary universe of these works, because I imagine, I don't know, I haven't done a lot of research on anime, and so I just talk about this because that's my favorite anime, and I saw these references and I went, well, that must be obvious. But I would argue that Japanese mythology is so explored in Japan that maybe introducing parts of Western culture and mixing them with Japanese myths, because in Full Metal Alchemist there's also part of Japanese myths. I would say it's a way to expand the universe of these stories.
Thank you.
Oh yes, very true. Okay, so I
just writing down the questions so I don't forget. I have a question to Amaya, but I'm not quite sure you'll be able to answer it because you can't specialize in everything. But I was just wondering, if you're writing about contemporary Latina narratives, which I understood aim to counteract the existing stereotypes of the Latina migrant. So I was thinking about the Polish migrants. And do you think that these stereotypes are just specific to those migrants, or are these stereotypes that go for other migrants as well? I'm just thinking because.
Well, I would say that they are affected by some stereotypes that are common to many migrants, and for example, discourse against migration has similar roots everywhere. But at the same time, I think there are some, for instance, derogatory terms that are used particularly for those of Mexican origin, and I can think of the word, for instance, excuse me, this is politically very incorrect, but beaners or wetbacks and these kind of words, I would say they are pretty specific and tied to the Latinx community. And so this is something that just came up right now, but I think, there are many stereotypes that are common to all migrants, but in the US, and particularly with the historical relations between the US and Mexico, there are many other stereotypes which affect Mexicans and then to a greater extent Latinxes, because that's another stereotype on itself, that all Latinxes are of Mexican origin, right? So yeah, I would say there are both of them.
I was just thinking about considering, which is totally strange because the United States are a migrant country, which is totally weird considering their origins. are they against all migrants by definition, or are they specifically against these migrants?
Oof, I have to say you're asking pretty difficult questions. Yeah, tough questions. Oof. There are many discourses, and I wanted to focus on legal changes because I think that's key to understand migration in the US. Nowadays, there are many people who say, oh yeah, my family migrated to the US, but they did so the right way. But what is the right way nowadays when there is no legal path for many, or a path that may take up to 20 years, right? So I would say one of the biggest instances of, well, or lack of knowledge is lack of the legal barriers that exist nowadays, yeah? And there are also many people who are, and we can see that nowadays, for political asylum and for refugees and so on, but against undocumented migration, right? The problem is many people apply for political asylum and so on, and because there are many legal barriers and so on, they can't be granted that. So there are different labels, and these labels have very different political, social implications, but the people who are affected by those labels, their situations are very different, but in many cases, they are pretty similar. I don't know if yeah. So for instance, recently I read Aileen Truax's We Build the Wall, and she focuses particularly on asylum seekers on the US-Mexico border, and she makes a very clear point about that. But yeah, I would say these are the main ideas. So on the one hand, this, I would say, lack of knowledge of how this legal process works, and on the other hand, the labels, what people think about those labels, and what the reality behind those labels is.
Thank you.
Okay.
Can I?
Last question.
Yeah, I guess the answer is going to be really short. So, Amaya, because you've told us all about these riders who were migrants, or they had this experience with being illegal, or their families being deported, etc. But then I was thinking, have you ever come across any text where the other point of view is shown? I mean, texts written by migrants, but the migrants were actually against legalizing other migrants. I mean, if you recall Donald Trump's campaign, I mean, there were many, I guess, legalized migrants who were clearly against Obama's ideas of, legalizing everybody. So.
Just let me think for a minute. Yeah, so there's one book. I tend to focus on Latina literature, and I tend to focus on that migration process. So the texts that I read most of the time are from that perspective. But there's one interesting text which I read many years ago, which is The Line Becomes a River by Francisco Cantú. He's of Latinx origin. I'm not sure, I would say he's of Mexican origin. And he was a border patrol agent for some time. Ooh. Yeah. So right now I can't give you any details because I read that a long time ago, but that was definitely very interesting.
There are this kind of text.
Yeah, there are. And then, for instance, there's Suketu Mehta. I think he's a journalist of Indian background, but who lives in the US. He's got this book called This Land is Our Land, an Immigrant's Manifesto. And then there he talks about migration, and he has this open borders perspective, but he also incorporates many people and voices who are against that for many reasons. And also I think this book is very interesting because he contrasts migration in different countries. I don't know if there's anything specific about Poland. I can remember Denmark, Germany, and so on. Mm-hmm. So yeah, but I'm not really
familiar.
No
female writers though, right?
I'm sure there are.
Yeah, I'm sure there are, yeah.
But I just don't know them, or I can't think about them right now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Yes. Yes, of course, by all means.
I just wanted to make a final remark on the comment Nayara did on Frankenstein, because I think you compared Frankenstein to Edward, and I think Edward is what Frankenstein could have been if he had faced his error, if he had dealt with the monster instead of escaping from him. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we are going to move on to our last